Welcome to the Sacred Life. I'm your host, Aaron Beachy, coming to you again from Higher Ground Fellowship in Kokomo, Indiana. We at the Sacred Life are dedicated to practical Christian ideas, and today we have for you another episode in our series on education. And leading our discussion today will be John Baylor. Joining us also is his brother David Baylor. And just kind of an opening question, John, in reference to education. The subject matter today will kind of be grades. When did you start to question the role of grades in education as we see it today?
Well, I'll give you a pivotal moment for me, and I guess I probably would have had certain skepticisms long before this, but it really became an interesting topic for me in a college psychology class. One of my professors was teaching us a little bit about motivation and extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation and how these things kind of interfere with each other. And he told us about a study, and I'm going to relate it as I remember it. I wasn't able to track down exactly a study with these same details, but there's lots and lots of studies that are basically just different versions of this same thing. And again, in my memory, what he told us was in this study, there were two groups. There was a group of kindergartners, well, they were both kindergartners, but there was one that's the experiment group, one that's the control group. And what they would do is they would give these kids paper and stuff to draw on, and the kids would draw pictures. And in the experiment group, when they turned the paper into the teacher, then they get a reward. They get a piece of candy or something like that. Now the other group, the control group, they would draw pictures, and then they just give it to the teacher, and then they get another piece of paper, and then they could draw something else. And so again, they're both drawing. One group is being rewarded for it. One group is not being rewarded for it. And after they run this experiment for a few weeks, then they find that the kids who received a reward did not like drawing pictures. They felt like it's not worth it to draw this picture and all I get is a stupid piece of candy. And the kids that never got a reward, they loved drawing, and they thought drawing was a fun thing to do, and it was a highlight of their day to just get this time where they don't have to do anything except draw pictures. And people actually do like drawing. That's something we're intrinsically motivated to do, although, I mean, by the time you guys are adults and old enough to seek out this kind of content, maybe a lot of you have lost your interest in drawing, but when you were a kid, you loved drawing pictures. I guarantee it. And so what you do, what's happened here is you have somebody who's intrinsically motivated to draw pictures, and then we give them a reward, which is an extrinsic motivation. And when we give them that extrinsic motivation, we undermine the intrinsic motivation, and it basically we destroy it.
Yeah.
And so I heard about this, and I thought, well, isn't this what we're doing when we grade something? When we give a kid a grade? A grade could be a reward or it could be a punishment depending on the quality of work that the student has done. But either way, it's an intrinsic motivator, whether it's a reward or a punishment. And kids, not only do they love drawing, but they also love learning. And that's something that people are naturally motivated to do. And then we put them through elementary school and middle school and high school, and maybe they go off to college or whatever, and we're giving them an extrinsic reward or punishment all along the way, year after year after year, and they get out of high school and they don't even like learning anymore. Mm-hmm. And it's really strange that you would have people who dislike learning. And so it seemed to me that what we've done is we've taken this extrinsic motivator of grades and we have used it to destroy our natural love of learning, or our kids' natural love of learning.
Yeah. I think it's interesting, that idea of the kids who were just given a paper to draw. They were finding the reward in what they were actually doing. It was a much deeper, more how do I want to say this? A much more effective. A much more effective, I don't know if I want to use the word gratification,
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
than just the instant gratification of a piece of candy, which would be a very fleeting gratification. You eat it and then it lasts for so many minutes and then it's gone.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember being a child drawing something. I could remember for days the enjoyment I had at something I drew.
Yeah.
And it would give me the desire for days after that to go back and draw something else. I mean, I could go back a week or 2 weeks later and it's like, man, I enjoyed that so much last time I did that I'm going to do it again.
Yeah, right.
And it left me with something much deeper than just a one-time thing.
Well, like what I'm thinking when you're talking about this, well, first of all, I thought it would be good for maybe those people that don't know it to very quickly define what is extrinsic and what is intrinsic.
Well, I mean, basically you would just say internal versus external.
Right.
So internal motivation, I'm naturally motivated to do something,
Yeah.
whereas the extrinsic would be an external, something that comes from outside. Again, a reward or punishment would be an
Yeah.
extrinsic motivation.
Right. And so where I was thinking with that was, yeah, this is, I guess I would say this is fairly simple psychological conditioning that we're talking about here.
Mhm.
You're conditioning a young child to think the reason I do something is for the hope of a reward.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I do something, the reason I do anything is because I'm going to get something for it. And then my decisions going forward are, you already said this, the child learns to think, well, the reward I'm getting for this is not worth it.
Right.
Whereas the child that never got any reward doesn't have that way of thinking. He thinks, I'm doing this because I enjoy doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's no matter of reward.
And you just get better work if you're intrinsically motivated.
Right.
If you're loving the process of learning or of creating something, then you're going to do a better job at learning or creating than if you're doing it to get a reward. Because if you're getting the reward, then basically your thought process becomes, okay, how can I do the minimum amount and still get a reward out of this thing? And if you're just learning because you love learning or you're interested in something, that's not your approach. You're not looking for like, how can I do the minimum and learn the thing that I'm trying to learn about?
Yeah.
You're just trying to learn as much as you can about it.
Extrapolate that out into the world and the way it works, and you can see the consequences of it everywhere.
Yeah.
I mean, how many people do we see or do we know on an individual level even where we see them show up at their job
Mhm.
just to get that reward of a paycheck at the end of the week, and that's only their primary focus.
It'd be way better to love your job.
Yeah, well, we're going to talk later more in detail about how these things work out, in terms of what does this mean for Christians.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a good point right here, just to bring that up, that isn't that the way we think about our faith, our religion? I mean, isn't that kind of what the idea of religion for a lot of people is what's required of me?
Mm-hmm.
What is the reward I'm getting out of this? So like, I kind of feel like I was in one way or another taught this idea, well, the reason I do something as a Christian is for the hope of a reward.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's for my heavenly reward.
Yeah.
It's like, there's things that Jesus says that you can interpret as him saying that. It's like, well, you're doing these things because you got a reward for you in heaven, or greater is your reward if you do these things or that thing. But if you look at it more closely, you begin to realize, well, Jesus is not teaching that you do things for a reward.
Mm-hmm.
But we do that as Christians, and so then we're faced with this problem that we have today is, well, this isn't necessary for my salvation, so why should I care?
Yeah, I'm not going to get something out of it, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So like this isn't an important thing because it doesn't have any bearing on my salvation. It's like you've warped the whole, like not only have you warped Christianity, as Aaron was saying, you have warped the whole world with that way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You're I mean, to me, like if you look through the things that Jesus said, then so much of it is about do the will of the Father.
Right.
And so little of it is about like, here's a reward for you. Anyway, we'll come around to some of these conclusions later.
Yeah.
I will also say like, this is kind of my quantum mechanics metaphor for this type of discussion. But when you measure something, you change the nature of that thing. Mm-hmm. So if you try to measure a kid's learning, you are changing the nature of his learning. his focus is now on how do I satisfy the measurement, and that is not where you want somebody's focus to be on anything in any area of life.
Right.
That's an excellent point. Okay, next question of focus, what would be your positions on grade at this point? You know, you've been a teacher, you've taught high school, you've taught some other situations and settings as well. So you have some experience in this, and you have had experience dealing with giving grades and things like that, but what would you say your position is at this point?
Okay, well, before the conversation's over, I'll try to break down the different purposes of grades, and a lot of them aren't gonna pan out that well, and some of them are gonna be useful and valid reasons to have grades. I think it's impossible or nearly impossible to create a system where grades don't exist in the modern world. And so my position is not to say like, hey, grades are bad, so let's just get rid of them. But my position is to say, hey, grades are reality, so what can we do here?
Yeah, okay. Okay, let's do,
Well, before we go on there, like,
okay.
we won't go too far with this, but I would say, like, I'm not sure, I mean, obviously you're far more qualified having been involved directly in teaching than I am. But like, I guess my knee-jerk reaction is like, I'm not entirely convinced that conclusion is correct.
Okay, so part of the reason why I say that is because if as a teacher I say, I'm done with grades, we're not gonna have grades anymore, then my administrators are gonna say,
You're not a teacher anymore.
right.
Yeah, and I guess,
Even if I had administrators who say, hey man, we agree with you, then I'm gonna have parents who say like, what in the world are you doing? How's my kid doing in your class? You're not giving me a grade, so I don't know what's going on. So you're not communicating with me as a parent. So I'm gonna get like rebellion from both sides. Now, I do think there are some systems where it would be possible to operate without grades, but if you're gonna have a school where, you know, like hundreds of kids are going through your school system at a time, for each grade level or whatever, then I don't know how you can pull it off. It's too much of a revolution, and if you create too much of a revolution, the teachers are gonna quit or get fired.
yeah, and I guess my way of looking at it would just go back to, well, I think this mass education system is a very bad idea. Like, when I mean I'm not convinced that that's right, I am convinced that it's right within the confines that you're talking about. Like, that's obviously true.
Oh, yeah, so we haven't had grades for very long.
Right, and like it just goes back to like, okay, let's look at Europe as the model. They surpass us in every educational metric that there is. They also don't have mass education.
Mm-hmm.
So that goes to our next question. What's a history of grades?
Okay, yeah, I'll try to give a sort of brief overview. I did just mention we haven't had grades for very long. The really brief version of this would be that at the beginning of grades, or at the beginning of the 1800s, grades basically don't exist. There's a little bit of evidence that there was some grades in the late 1700s, but again, beginning of 1800s, they basically don't exist. By the end of the 1800s, our system that we use for grades has been developed, and it's used by almost nobody. And so after that system is developed, then it becomes like a 1900s, like a 20th century development for actually spreading this to all schools everywhere. To break that down just a little bit more, the idea of a pass or fail, if you count that as a grade, that idea has been around for a long, long time. And I think probably about as long as we can prove that there has been formal education, then we can prove that there has existed some pass-fail somewhere along the way. But the phenomenon that we know of right now, where we're gonna try to quantify how much you've learned as best as we can. We're gonna do that with a percentage, or with a letter grade, or with a 4.0 or 12.0 grade point system. That's all an invention of the United States of America. It starts off in Harvard and Yale, again, maybe at the very end of the 1700s, but we've got like very sparse evidence, so it's something like they kind of dabbled in here and there. And when they first developed this idea of quantifying student achievement, they were very inconsistent about why are we doing this? What are we going to do with grades? So early on, I shouldn't say early on. I'll just give a sampling of like different periods in history. Harvard and Yale would have these practices where, okay, we're going to give grades to students, but we're not going to share those with anybody except within the school. The faculty can use these grades to communicate with one another about how a student is doing. And at other times they say, you know what, we're going to share these grades with everybody. We're going to post them publicly so every student in the school can look at this bulletin board kind of thing and see where everybody is doing on all of their grades. And maybe, I don't know, foster competition. Other times they'll say, well, we're not going to do that, but what we'll do is we'll communicate these to the students' parents, and then the parents will know, and they'll be able to work alongside their kids. So there's all these different theories about what in the heck are grades for, and they just try them all out. And it's very strange because it's like there actually was no purpose for assigning grades. They knew we wanted to measure student achievement somehow, but they didn't know why it was going to be beneficial.
Well, this is
so they just tried everything.
Yeah, I mean, like this is also like the age of science.
Yeah, right.
Where like we're trying to figure out how can we quantify everything.
Right.
Like this is the great drive at this period in the early 1800s is how can we make everything a science? And like we don't even know why it should be a science. We just believe that it should be.
Right.
Yeah.
So when we get into the 1900s, then grades start to become more of a way for institutions to communicate with one another, and that remains probably the most important purpose for grades today. So if somebody's graduating high school and the prospective college wants to know, like, well, how did they do in school, then we use grades as a way of telling them that. Or if we transfer from one college to another, because this was all colleges initially. So that kind of develops mostly in the 1900s. The idea of the grade curve also develops in the early 1900s because your grade doesn't actually communicate something to a different institution unless grades are kind of standardized for everybody in some way. So the grade curve is a way to say, well, a certain percentage of students will get this grade, a certain percentage will get a B, a certain percentage will get a C. And once we have that, then now when one random high school pops up and says, hey, this student got all A's, well, now that actually means something because that tells me how that student compared to all the other students that went to that high school. So that grade curve idea has been controversial, and it's kind of come in and out a lot through the 20th century. Yeah. It's not very popular at all right now. In the 1940s, I don't have a whole lot of specific numbers on these things, but this is just something that I picked up from a few different sources. In the 1940s, grades are still pretty rare, not widespread at all, and especially among high schools, but even colleges. It's not extremely widespread. This surprised me. In 1970, only 2/3 of high schools in America used grades. So again, we're talking about a way of doing education that actually is not old at all, and that's maybe part of the reason for your objection. Is like we had education among human societies and among the West, and in the United States of America we had education for a long time, and people just weren't using grades. For most of you guys listening, your parents probably had grades, your grandparents maybe not, your great-grandparents probably did not have any grades. It just didn't exist.
Well, just
so
based off
that far back in time.
Based off that information right there, like you said, even into 1970, only 2/3 of like high schools were using a grading system. I mean, it's very possible the likelihood that some of the astronauts that went to space, maybe some of them were in a high school that didn't use a grading system. And those were very highly educated, highly intelligent individuals.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and then the German scientists that built our space program definitely didn't have grades.
Yeah. Right.
But looking at, sorry, I just completely lost the thought I had there. Let me get back to you, Baker.
That's failing grade for you.
Right. No, I remember now.
No, don't say a failing grade. Let's quantify this thing.
Let's give it a numerical
precise
value.
percentage. Yeah.
you also have this idea in the 20th century, especially, and I mean it preceded the 20th century by a bit, but progress for the sake of progress.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it doesn't matter whether or not the new thing that we're doing is better than the old thing. The old thing is bad because it's old, and the new thing is good because it's new.
Yeah.
And so like there's often like a reckless adoption of novelty.
Yeah.
So like this is the new thing. This is what, and like this is still a problem that we have today in our culture, is what's new is good because it's new.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had a system of education that had worked for, I don't know, probably for thousands of years, had been amazingly successful.
Yeah.
And when was the educational system, like you mentioned the astronauts,
Mm-hmm.
was the educational system that was behind the golden age of American advancement. And then we just like, ever since then, education has been defined by failure.
Yeah. And decline.
Right.
Yeah. So not all these education topics will be like an aspect of education and its history, but we looked at homework and we looked at grades, and their timelines are very, very similar, that they kind of rise in prominence in the middle of the 1800s and don't really take over until middle or late 20th century. I mean, it kind of all goes back to this idea in the 1800s, everything's got to be science based, everything's got to be progressive and somehow, and so they call this progressive education. And what that means, we're going to throw out what we now today call the classical model of education. We're going to get rid of that, and we're going to do something that's progressive and scientific instead. And I mean, in a sense, it seemed like, well, it must have worked, because look at what we did in the first half of the 20th century and look at all that we accomplished. And it's like, well, but that system hadn't taken over at that point. We think that it had,
Right.
but it really hadn't. It wasn't. It was at the end of the golden age of America and American education that this stuff actually became everywhere.
So I'm thinking, what comes to my mind right now is the movie Hoosiers. And you probably know specifically the line I'm thinking of. As like one of the kids on the team is giving his speech in school, and his speech is about progress, and he's mentioning all of these things about progress. And one of the things that he mentions is school consolidation.
Yeah.
Which is also the thing that makes that story so that it will never have to again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's like, this is seen, like the whole point of the speech is progress for the sake of progress.
Yeah. Right.
And that thing, I remember even very young, that point about school consolidation sticking out. Because it's like already when I was young, we're in this time when we're saying that was actually a terrible idea.
Yeah. Right.
Like, because now what we have is no accountability for students. Teachers that just they're not in touch.
Yeah,
they can't.
We'll get to
this
school
is
consolidation in another.
Right.
That will definitely be another topic.
Right, but it's like, this is not a criticism of teachers. Teachers today are put in an impossible situation, and I think most of them know it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like
Exactly.
we just can't handle what's being put on us. Like, this is just it's not fair to the students. It's not fair to the teachers. It's not fair to it's destructive to society as a whole. But it all comes from this same rotten idea that's behind grades.
Mm-hmm.
That's like, well, this is new, this is scientific, this is progress.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and keep it rolling.
Okay. Our next question is, what do grades actually do?
Okay. I'll give kind of a list of, here are some different purposes of grades, and there's probably a few things that I don't include on my list, but this is going to cover most takes of what would be the purpose. One, I mean, you could just say to measure achievement. So we have some sort of mark. Of course, that's the fundamental. That's what we're trying to do when we put a grade on something. But measuring student achievement actually doesn't work very well. When you give somebody a grade, or when the high school communicates to the college, well, this student got a B plus in such and such a class. That actually doesn't tell the college why they got a B plus, because it could be it could be a sign of how well they understood the material, or it could be a sign of how hard they worked in the class. And I mean, both of those are good things. Mm-hmm. And the college wants a student who understands the material and one who works hard. But it's like, we don't actually know what we're measuring. In some classes, it just means you showed up every day, and then you get a B plus. So it's very unclear what we're measuring. And then also, there are just problems with trying to measure student achievement, student accomplishments. You can divide grades into two basic camps: objective grades and subjective grades. And the objective grade would be there's a clear right or wrong answer to this, and when we look at your answer, we can see yes, that's correct, or no, that's incorrect. There's no questions about it. Nothing subjective. No, it doesn't matter the teacher's impression. The impression that you made on the teacher. It just matters, did you have the right answer or did you have the wrong answer? And this would be an instance of where measuring the thing changes the nature of it, and we're not getting the student to do the thing that we want to do. So the quintessential objective measurement would just be a multiple choice test. And what you are measuring with a multiple choice test is how well the student got this information into their short-term memory. You are not measuring like any form of mastery of the material. You're not really measuring comprehension of any kind, but even if you are, you're still measuring something that's rooted in this really short-term understanding.
A great example of that would be when you come to a four-way stop and 4 cars come to the stop at the same time. You can pretty easily see who mastered the material and drivers and who didn't. I'll let you continue though.
Yeah, so I mean, no educator has a dream of developing students' short-term memory, and that's what you're going to measure with an objective measurement. Now the other is you could have subjective, which would mean, well, I'll just say that would be something like an essay, or like a long answer sort of thing. Anything that the teacher is making a judgment call on what sort of grade the student got, and a judgment call rather than like, oh, they circled A and they were supposed to circle B. That's not my judgment as a teacher that determines whether that's right or wrong. But if I'm grading an essay for a kid, then I have to see like, okay, how well did they do on their sentence structure? I mean, even grading grammar in an essay is actually sort of complex. It's hard to come up with a really objective system for that. But when it comes to something like how well did you organize this, how well did you support your position with research, you can try to be objective about those things, but you won't succeed. And subjective measurements, they are just not good. And when I say they're not good, I mean like they're not accurate, they're not consistent. If you give the same essay to 2 different teachers, they're going to give 2 different grades on it. And in part it's because they have different systems. But not only will teachers grade inconsistently between one another, but if you give, and I'll just go ahead and say me, I was an English teacher, I graded essays, like I'm aware of these problems and you try to combat them the best that you can. But if you give me an essay and I grade it, I'm going to put 1 grade on it. And if you give me the same essay 3 months later, I'm going to grade it again and it's going to have a different grade on it. And I'm not really confessing a personal fault. That's the reason that I know that's true is because of what the research says about it. So it's very inconsistent. There are a lot of biases when it comes to subjective grading as well. This is something that I have an English master's degree, and I took some education classes as a master's student, and my teachers were really big on the problems of bias, but they really just didn't have any clue what was going on. Okay, for one thing, what I would hear from my teachers was racial bias, and if you have like we'll just say a white sounding name, that student's probably going to get a higher grade, regardless of the political beliefs or whatever of the teacher that's grading it. Like your beliefs don't protect you from these biases. Okay, so there's that problem. The white sounding name gets a higher grade than the black sounding name. But what my teachers wouldn't tell me, because they were convinced of the importance of feminist pedagogy. And so they would emphasize how you need to go out of your way to help out the girls in your class and build them up because the boys have an unfair advantage because everybody's biased against boys. And that is not true. It is true in certain fields, but in English studies, the bias runs the other direction. And so if you get a paper that has a girl's name on it, it's going to get a higher grade than the same paper if it has a boy's name on it. There just is not a way to get around that subjective bias. And again, people can do these different trainings to be more sensitive or whatever, or you can claim that you're a feminist pedagogue or whatever, but it's not going to work. You just can't overcome these things. So subjective grading, it's just, my point there was that measuring student achievement, whether you're trying to be objective or you're trying to be subjective, there are big problems with trying to actually precisely measure any kind of student achievement. Grades can be used, another purpose of grades would be to provide feedback to the student to say this is how you're doing. And what the research shows is that if I put a grade on your essay and I give you comments on what you did well at and what needs improvement, and I give that to you, what you see is the grade. And you really don't even see my feedback. It's very rare to see something that I've given to you in feedback and you think about that and you change your writing practices as a result. If I give you an essay and it has no grade and it has my comments on it, then I give it to you and you see the comments and you think about what I've written and you change your approach to writing as a result of that. So grades are supposed to be a way of providing feedback, but actually what they do is they prevent you from seeing the feedback. So we would be much better at providing feedback if we actually just told students what they were doing well and if we just gave them feedback.
Yeah.
Giving them a grade interferes with our giving them feedback.
So it'd be kind of like if you graded my essay and gave me a B- and said good effort or something like that.
Well, or if I said your intro didn't set up the subject matter. I didn't know what to expect in the paper.
Yeah.
Something specific about what you can work on rather than just good effort or whatever. But yeah, I can give you a detailed explanation of what to do better at in your intro next time you write one.
Mm-hmm.
But you will see, oh, he gave me a B- and now he's trying to explain why he gave me a B-.
Right.
Like, no. The purpose of the comment had nothing to do with the grade. The purpose was, where are you at as a writer?
Yeah.
But that's not how you're going to interpret it.
Right.
Grades might be seen as a way of fostering competition between students. And I mean, you could react against that just by saying, well, competition isn't good. I wouldn't take that stance, but I would say, okay, what type of competition? What are students competing for? If we're giving them grades as a way of fostering competition, they're competing for a measurement.
Well, like not only are they competing for a measurement, they're competing for a useless measurement.
Yeah, right.
Because like that's what comes back to me is the fact that like grades are a very poor predictor of success, of career or life success.
Mm-hmm.
And so
yeah, there's a lot of like college professors who will tell their students the A students in this class will be working for the C students. The C students will be the guys that work
Right.
out running companies.
yeah. And like a lot of that comes back to the fact that the C students are the guys who've seen like the uselessness of the whole system. So it's like, I'm just gonna do enough to get by.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So I'll try to get through this. I want to make a few more comments about different purposes of grades. In terms of fostering competition, students did compete with each other to know the most before there were grades. And there's a nice story about Isaac Newton getting picked on by a bully, and he wound up beating the bully up. But that wasn't enough, and he decided he was going to become the best student. He was a terrible student in school beforehand, but when it came to competition, he decided, I'm going to show this guy up. I'm not only going to beat him up physically, but I'm going to best him in every possible way, and then he became like the best student in the school. He was not getting grades. He was learning. So I mean, that's what, I don't know if I want to hold that up and say like, be more like Isaac Newton and beat up the bully, but you can compete over knowledge and understanding. And if you're competing over grades instead, then you're just missing the mark.
So if you're looking at this from a feminine perspective, you can make a point of competition as a negative. From a masculine perspective, like for boys and for men, competition is essential.
It is.
So like like if you're hearing this idea of competition as a negative, like absolutely it's not. Like anybody who is male knows like competition, like it can certainly get out of hand. But just like anything, it can get out of hand. It's like that's, I mean, you could just look at it as simple. That's how we measure ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanna switch over to a couple of positive reasons for grades, because most of what I've said so far has been critical. Grades can be, now I did already criticize actually this idea of using grades to motivate people because of how that can undermine their intrinsic motivation. But grades can be used to motivate students in a helpful way. And in particular, if you've got a student who's kind of borderline, like, oh man, this guy's got a 55%, he's failing the class, then I can go to that student and I can say, look, you're close, man, here's where you're at, and if you can do this and this and this, then you're gonna pass the class. And then I've got this guy who's just been sitting around not doing very much, and he says, oh shoot, I am gonna fail this class, and if I buckle down, then I'll do it. And now he gets up off his butt and he starts doing something and he's accomplishing something, and then he passes the class, and then he's proud of the work that he put into it. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff that comes from that. And as a teacher, it would be really difficult to lose that motivational aspect of grades. To have somebody who's right on the edge and is falling off the edge, and I don't have grades as a way of saying, no, don't fall off. Let's climb back on board here. So to some extent, the motivational aspect of grades can be really useful. And then the other thing is, as I mentioned before, communication between institutions. That is handy to have that ability for a high school that's graduating hundreds of students to be able to say to a college, hey, these are the grades he got, therefore he's this type of student. I think that's really the most important purpose of grades. I think that's really why we're not going to get rid of grades. And when I say that's the most important part of grades, what I'm saying is the most important function of grades does not have anything to do with student learning, student achievement, or anything like that. It's a matter of communication between institutions.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How does the subject of grades, or how we do grades, fit in with practical Christian ideas?
Okay, so we brought up a little bit of this already, but a couple ideas here would just be, one, be very cautious about giving rewards and seeking rewards. So grades is an example of that, but again, I mean, David already brought up the point about in Christian faith, if we've got a faith that's built on, I'm going to earn some kind of reward for myself, then we're, I mean, Jesus actually did speak specifically against that mindset.
Right.
Like look at yourself as someone who's not worthy of receiving a reward, and just don't focus on the reward.
Well, yeah, like he also mentions, like in the Sermon on the Mount, you have talk about the hypocrites. And the hypocrites are those who are doing things for a reward.
Mm-hmm.
And what he says is that's all the reward they're going to get.
Right. Yeah, that's the next thing I got written on my paper here. When you receive your reward in full, you miss out on the reward that the Father gives you.
Right.
And I mean that you can see that really clearly with grades. If you're focused on that reward, then you're missed out on well, I mean, I would just say. Yeah. I mean, this isn't exactly metaphor when I say this. Then you're missing out on the heavenly reward. You're missing out on the actual learning and knowledge and understanding that you could have gotten because you were focused on a reward. But I mean, that just applies to all different areas of life.
Right.
Seek ye first the kingdom of God. Don't worry about that reward that you're going to get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Let's see. I think I guess maybe just another point I would add on that is when we focus on things that we can measure, we're usually focusing on the wrong thing.
Yeah.
But I'll just leave it at that.
A final question: What can teachers or students do differently? And I mean, this gets down to the nitty-gritty of it, but this goes into what you've observed as a teacher, being a student in college, all the way back to your days of high school and grade school.
Mm-hmm.
You've seen it all. You've seen both sides of it. So what are some things that you've tried that are different? And what are some things that you've seen some students try that maybe that are different?
Okay, well, one thing, this will apply to something I specifically said about providing feedback. If you're a teacher, then you might look for ways to separate the grade from the feedback. And that might mean if we're working on essays, then if my students are writing or researching in class, then maybe I can approach. This takes some dedication to do this, but it's possible. I have done this in my classes. You approach every single student individually and you look at their work, and while you're sitting there with them looking at their computer or whatever, their paper that they're writing on or whatever, you look at it with them and you say, okay, now if you try this or this or this, then that will work a little bit better. And even to say to them, like, look, this will get about this level of work, a 90% if you do it like this, or this will get you a 75%. Because it's missing this right here. So what I want you to do is I want you to focus on this and this and this. And then, then they can finish their work later, and then when they're done, then I can give them a grade. And I don't have to give a lot of explanation because I already explained to them why they're going to get what grade they got. But even though I was referencing their grade when I was sitting with them, I still separated the grade from the feedback in a way. And you don't need to grade everything that students do. And to some extent, you'll have students who will just say, well, if you're not going to grade it, I'm not going to do it. Which you'll have students who won't do work even when you are grading it. Especially these days. I mean, yeah, this partly that's a post-COVID world. What's that?
I said I should probably not say anything.
But what you want to do is you want students who are intrinsically motivated to do the work, and especially if you're going to have something that's not graded, then you make it clear to the students, this is why we're doing this is what you're going to gain from this. And if it's something that has a good level of challenge, good level meaning not too easy and not too hard, then that's also motivating. Like, present it to them as a challenge, a challenge that they can tackle, and that is motivating for people. If it's something that's fun, then that is intrinsically motivating to people. But what I started with was explain why they're doing this, if it matters, if they know that they're going to benefit in some practical and especially some immediate way where this helps them in the short term. Because sometimes when you say, like, well, this in your career you're going to need to do this and this and this, well, that doesn't mean anything to students most of the time. But if you can give them some sort of application of again in the short term how they will benefit from developing this skill, then that's motivating to them.
Yeah.
I want to insert something real quick here. I said I shouldn't say something, but actually I'll go ahead and expose myself a little bit. Like, I was one of those kids that never did homework because I hated homework, but like it was actually a value judgment that I was making, is that, well, I know I can pass the test. I know that I know this stuff, so the homework is useless. It's not worth the grade I'm gonna get. And so, like, this all sounds very reasonable and logical, but actually what that ended up doing is teaching me a very bad habit, which is to make a value judgment based on the benefit I could see out of something. So, like, that's putting far too much emphasis on my ability to see and to understand. And so, like, I carry that forward into life, and like, if I apply that to my Christianity, then like, I don't see the benefit, I don't see the purpose of this, so why should I do it? It's like, because you don't know everything, that's why. Like, sometimes things are good because they're good, and just because you can't see it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it.
So,
now, I try to avoid too long term of a horizon when I'm talking to students, as I said. But like, sometimes, and I would try to address this problem of why are we doing this? Why does this matter? I try to address that before students would complain about it. But when I hear students complaining about that, and especially when they're complaining about what they have to do in their algebra class or geometry, when they're complaining about some other class besides mine, then I would especially make this kind of point that, like, you do not know what is going to be beneficial to you. And I would tell some stories about me using computer programming in order to run a music business, a music performance business. And like I would not have anticipated when I was young that this skill would have this use for me. If my dream, and I mean, I actually I did nothing but music full time for 5 years, but for most people that's just unrealistic to think like, oh, I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna be a professional full-time musician, whatever. But even if you have some unrealistic, stupid dream like that,
Right.
then you're just not going. You cannot tell what skills you're going to need in order to make that work. Like what you need to do is just learn as much as you can about everything you possibly can,
Yeah.
and then whatever you do in life, you're just going to be better off. But
So-
again, it goes back to the same idea that you're saying. It's like you do not know
Right.
what is
And-
going to help you.
But it's like, how is that, like, I'm putting too much emphasis on my knowledge and
Mhm.
understanding. I'm conditioning myself to think in a way that my vision, my ability to see and to understand matters.
Mm-hmm.
Like, first of all, no, actually it doesn't.
Yeah.
And then that stands in the way of faith. And then the question in my mind is, well, how is that shaping Christianity today? And I think it's shaping it in tragic and detrimental ways. Like it's just like how much of this performance
it's weird. Like we get teenagers, we incite teenagers to overthrow the traditions of the church, and we incite teenagers to do that, or we have been inciting them for the last 30 years or whatever to do that because they're passionate and because they don't understand the purpose of these traditions, and so it's easy to persuade them to say like, hey, since you don't understand this stuff, go ahead and rail against it and yeah.
Right. Well, it's like Moses was passionate to overthrow the Egyptians, and so he murdered a guy,
Mhm.
and then had to go spend 40 years in the desert to learn meekness.
Yeah.
And Paul was passionate to serve God, and so he murdered Christians, and then had to go and spend 3 years in the desert to learn meekness. So it's like that's what you're missing from this equation is meekness
Yeah.
and patience.
Yeah.
It's like your passion has to be tempered by something.
Yeah. Another thought that I had in reference to what teachers can do differently, or even what students can do differently in participating in this is adding some trial and error. And I'll give a little example, and this has to do with the line of work that I'm in. I do construction, and on the job we're doing right now. Well, my younger brothers work with me, and they would call the roof. We just completed the roof system. It's what my brothers would describe as a complex roof system because they're not as experienced. I wouldn't because I've been doing it for so long, so it's not that complex to me. I can visualize it in my mind. But
Yeah.
when we do these roof systems, we'll use like these calculators. And these, calculators on our phones, and you enter in the dimensions that you have built, and you enter the numbers into the calculator, and it's supposed to give you the exact dimensions of the hip rafters you cut and everything. But then we cut them according to the specifications, but then we put them up there,
They don't work.
and they don't. Sometimes they don't. And I would say probably about 30% of the time, they fit like they're supposed to, and about the rest of the 70% of the time it requires some trial and error.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good example of you're going to have to get outside of the structure of that calculator to make what you need to happen. And maybe you could say grades can sometimes be an example of that calculator right there.
Yeah.
Is that's not going to give you, maybe it's about 30% of the equation, but it's not going to give you everything you need. You need a little bit of trial and error too.
Well, this just popped into my mind while you're thinking. We really do need to wrap up. We're running out of time, so I'll just throw this out there, and then you can decide what to do from there. That are we conditioning people to think that failure is bad?
Yeah.
Because actually, it's not.
Right.
And but through our grade system, we're teaching people success means you get it right all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And failure is to be avoided at all costs. Failure is the end. Failure is failure.
Yeah.
It's like, but actually, no, it's not.
Mm-hmm.
Failure is how you learn. And so it's like we were talking about SpaceX earlier. It's like, and then them having this philosophy that failure is necessary to get to the goal.
Mhm.
It's like we're gonna blow up 100 rockets before we get one that works right, and like
Yeah.
that was our plan all along.
Right.
It's because we learn from the times they don't blow up.
Yeah. That's something that I really love about playing music is messing up.
Right.
Because when you're messing up in music, then you're playing a line and you hit the wrong note, then next time through I'm gonna play the same line and I'm gonna hit the same wrong note, and then I'm gonna do the same line again, and then I'm gonna hit the wrong note, and then I'm gonna slide it up to the fret where it's supposed to be. It's like I'm gonna play with my mistake. I'm gonna play with my failure, and when I play with it, then like it becomes something exciting and I mean, you could say beautiful, but just exciting and fun. I think it's even more accurate than saying beautiful. There's my daughter is a little anxious about making mistakes when she's in school, and there's an extent to which, as parents, we want her to think like, hey, if you make mistakes, no problem, like that's part of it.
Right.
We want you operating in a realm where you're going to make mistakes. We don't want you performing at a level where you're going to get everything right all the time. We want you to push yourself, and that means like push yourself to the point where you mess up.
Yeah.
It's like you're gonna learn things through mistakes and failures that you wouldn't learn otherwise.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and the fact that you're failing means you're where you're supposed to be. Like you're challenging yourself.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, playing it safe. I mean, and it's not uncommon for a good student to take an easy class because they don't want to get a bad grade.
Right.
And they know if they take the easy class, then okay, fine, I won't learn as much, but the hard class might hurt my GPA. And
Right. And like that's kind of where I'm thinking with this idea of failures, because
That would have been me in school.
but like a mistake I make and I fail a test, that has a permanent effect on my educational career.
Yeah.
So like I can't not risk that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, okay, well the cost of that is you're not learning anything.
Yeah.
And like, man, you're also conditioning yourself in a way that isn't going to suit you very well going forward in life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then my last word to students, this is something I already mentioned, I guess, but just to say one more time, is this idea of seek ye first the kingdom of God. If you're focusing on grades, you're focusing on the wrong thing. And so just let it go and just instead focus on, all right, I'm here in school, there's people trying to teach me stuff, I'm gonna learn whatever I can learn. And what happens for my grades is just gonna happen, I mean, I'll get what I get, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here to learn.
Yeah. All right, I think that's a good thought to end on. Again, we thank you for joining us today on The Sacred Life, and please comment. Also, please subscribe to the channel.
Yeah, tell your stories about grades. I'm sure there's
a few
lots of awful ones.
Yeah, give us your feedback.
Lots of traumatic memories.
Yeah.
Share it with your friends, family, relatives, not friends, anybody else you can think of. But we love your feedback and we appreciate it. So thank you again for joining us, and we wish you peace in Christ.